Hi guys, good morning or good afternoon, depending on what time you're watching this. Hopefully you all know this is part of the second cluster of this cultural awareness content that we'll be covering, which is the stolen generations. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon which I am on right now, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to both elders past, present, and emerging. I'd also like to take a second and for you to take a second to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that you're watching this clip on, and acknowledge them caring for country, keeping connected to culture, and also that sovereignty on that country was never ceded. Especially considering the topic that we're covering today, I'd like to also pay tribute to the stolen generations, those who have made it home, those who are still searching, and those who rest in the dream time of their ancestors. I'd like to pay my deepest respects to their strength and resilience, because without that, we wouldn't still be connected to country and community, or have strong leadership within our communities because of them. So my name is Lillian. I'm proud Darug and Gamilaroi woman who grew up on Dudurul, Wairau and Wiradjuri country of the Albury-Wodonga area. You'll hear a bit later on throughout the presentation, but I come from a strong matriarchal family with two black nans. On my mother's side, Nan Val was a Darug woman who was born in Wilcannia, but his traditional connections come from the Blue Mountains up near Sydney on the Hawkesbury River. And Bargie, which is Gamilaroi language for Nan, was stolen from a traditional country in Pilliga, which is up near Walgett, Coonut Barrow in northern New South Wales. But you'll get to hear a bit more about them a bit later. But yes, just please be mindful throughout this presentation. Some of you may know a lot about this topic. Some of you may be hearing about this stuff for the first time, but please be mindful to look after yourself and feel free to pause and take some time to reflect or just really sit in this space, I think, for a while, because it may be seen as something that happened a long time ago, but we know, and you'll know after this presentation, that there are long-lasting intergenerational effects from this, not to mention stolen generation survivors still being alive and with us. So yeah. So when people think the stolen generations, I think, especially broader Australia, I think they believe, it happened so long ago and, why do we have to say sorry and all of that? But I just wanted to break down what the stolen generations actually means. And this is a definition from Link Up Victoria, which is a program at VACCA. So the stolen generations are any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander who was separated from their family, community, traditional culture, and traditional country. So separated can mean a person was removed under the past government acts, including the Native Welfare Act, Aboriginal Welfare Act, but it also includes people who were adopted, fostered, or placed in an institution under other government legislation. If you haven't had a lot to do with Link Up, I know that Link Up does many events throughout the year, such as the National Sorry Day and the anniversary of the National Apology. I don't know, as a VACCA employee, you're allowed to attend those events. But it's important that we acknowledge that the stolen generation isn't just pigeonholed to 1910 to 1970. And actually, the term stolen generations was coined after the national inquiry into the separation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from their families. So I guess it's a name that was reclaimed by the stolen generation survivors. Yeah, and I think it's always important to acknowledge sorry, that, yeah, it's not pigeonholed to 1910 to 1970, because we know people were removed and forcibly removed before 1910 and even 1970 and after 1970. So it's always important to highlight that. How were the children removed? I think this is always an important spot to kind of sit and reflect, because a lot of the time we assume that it's just about neglect or, saving the Aboriginal people and things like that, because I guess that's how it was sold to our Aboriginal people, and also sold to white Australia as well. We're doing the best that we can. And I think in John Pilger, one of his documentaries, he says to soothe the dying pillar of the Aborigines. And that's what they essentially thought that they were doing, some people. But these are some examples as to why children were removed. So removed through the dormitory system. And this began early on throughout the mission stage, when families were moved onto a mission. They would slowly start removing children from a family, depending on age, and like boys would be going to different homes to sleep, and when girls matured, different ages, they would be moved away from their parents and then shoved out to employment. And that's also leading into the next point, forcible removal through employment. So children are removed because their parents were not living on missions or settlements. I think it's something we don't talk about a lot, that this country essentially was created on slavery, and children were removed for forced employment, because with the acts that were involved, Aboriginal people didn't need to be paid a normal wage, and even if they were paid, it wasn't on par with the white Australian people. And if you look at the stats, there's actually over almost $500 million of stolen wages out there for our stolen generation kids. Placed in detention was a form of child removal, and this could be done for anything. There is examples of people being placed in detention simply because they were practicing culture, simply because they were speaking language, because they refused to leave their brothers and sisters and things like that. People were actually put in jail for this. So exploitation, sexual exploitation, we know because of resources like the Bringing Home Report and also historical documents, that Aboriginal women, especially Aboriginal girls, were taken by farmers and settlers for sexual exploitation. Not to mention the sexual exploitation that happened within the missions and also in the foster homes and also the training homes. So holiday schemes, this is one of the things that you kind of really realise that it was a calculated move by the government to do this stuff, because they would say to parents, oh, we're just going to take, your daughter or your son across to Brisbane because they've never seen the beach before, or, to the snow, we're going to take them on a holiday and then we'll bring them back. The harsh reality was that these children were taken over state lines and never seen again. Because when you think about it logically, if you're an Aboriginal person from Darwin in the 1950s who may or may not even understand or speak English, and your child's taken to Victoria, what means do you actually have to go and find your child? And there are examples, there are stories of people who did try and find their children, did everything they possibly could, but were lied to by the authorities. And some were even told that their child had died. So police intervention, and I think this is something that we really need to discuss, is the role of police removals. And I think that if you understand this, you can really understand the intergenerational effects and the sort of bad, I guess, relationship that a lot of Aboriginal people have with police now. Hospital removals, So big one, people were told that their children had passed away, or they left their child in hospital for a couple of days because they had to get vaccinations or were a bit sick, and the mothers would come back to find out their child was gone. Also adoption. I think the harsh reality is that, you know, as I was speaking about it before, Aboriginal mothers sometimes didn't have access to means to not only follow their child, but also even be able to understand what documents they were signing. So there's stories of women who were told that they were signing, you know, a welfare document or, you know, some sort of document for support, when in reality they were signing an adoption form, but didn't understand what was on the page. And it's also important to acknowledge that kids were adopted overseas. For example, Russell Moore, who's currently doing a life sentence in Florida. It's always important that we acknowledge that some of our stolen gen mob will never make it home, will never know where they come from, or will never be connected because of this forced adoption. So these are some examples as to why children were removed. So at risk of immorality, the mother is 14 years of age, in need of care and protection, for better education, for speaking out against authority, a suitable age of apprenticeship, failure to conform to discipline or assimilation, in need of care or control, because of their circumstances, orphan, unable to locate parents or family, neglect, likely to be married off to an Aboriginal, for being Aboriginal. And I think I'm just going to take a little while to kind of break these down and explain some of these to you. Because for a lot of time, you'll literally see in documents or people talking about the neglect of Aboriginal people. And I think it's always important that we acknowledge the forced poverty that Aboriginal people experienced. And it wasn't something that we chose. It was something that was forced upon us. You know, we were forced from a traditional way of life into a Western world that we didn't understand, nor were we set up or supported to be able to care for our kids in a Western setting. And neglect is an opinion, essentially. And back then they didn't understand the cultural differences between Aboriginal people and non-Aboriginal people. And neglect was seen as our kids running around without shoes on, or multiple kids being in a room. But that was the cultural norm for us. But yes, definitely acknowledging the forced poverty as well, because we were stopped from hunting our traditional foods, but then couldn't afford to feed our families, for example, because if we did hunt, we were arrested. For better education, that's a big one, because some mothers, some families genuinely thought or believed that, you know, their kids were going to go to boarding school or get a better education and then would come home to them. You know, they thought that they were doing the right things for their children, when in reality they never saw them again. They were taken across state lines and they never saw them again. It wasn't just about education. A lot of our stolen generation survivors, they can tell you, you know, that their education was at a 3rd or 4th grade level, and when they turned old enough, they were sent out to apprenticeships. Not only that, I think it's really about knowing that it was, and this is where we talk about the role of police and government authorities and officials. Parents would allow their children to be taken to missions close to them, because they thought they would be able to visit them. They thought the children would be able to leave and come and visit them, because they feared that if they didn't, they would be forcibly removed and taken over state lines where they wouldn't have access to them. They thought that if they didn't, they were threatened. There's examples of people being threatened, like, if you don't give up this kid, we're going to take all of the kids. So things like in need of care and control, or failure to conform to discipline or assimilation. This is an opinion as well. And the opinion at the time was Aboriginal people had to stop practicing culture, speaking language, and essentially breeding out the Aboriginal population. So if kids were seen speaking language or practicing culture, they could be forcibly removed for that, for just doing what they had grown up being taught. And I think that's a big shocker, especially for anyone with children. Likely to be married off to an Aboriginal. As we know, in a lot of states and the territories, it was actually illegal for Aboriginal people to even marry each other because of the assimilation policies. Unable to locate parents or family, but also the orphan one. That's a big one. Like, for example, I worked with a client at Link Up who was searching for a mum, and mind you, she was only in her mid-40s. When I met her, she was searching for a mum, and a nanny met her, and she's like, I know who your mum is. Like, I'll get in contact with her. She'll contact you within 2 weeks. And 2 weeks rolled by, 4 weeks, couple of months, nothing, until she ended up getting a phone call. And, this woman was like, oh, I'm your mum. And the auntie said to me, she's like, oh, I didn't believe it. And the first thing I said, I was like, why didn't you call me earlier? And her mum had said, they told me that you had died. And I think for anyone with children, that is a horrible reality to face, that the government out there, the hospitals, the welfare system, literally told them that their children had died so that they wouldn't try to follow up, so they wouldn't try to find them or get their children back. So they were grieving for kids that were actually alive. So the removal of Aboriginal children. So in 1869, the Border Protection of Aborigines was established. So the provisions included the care, custody and education of the children of Aborigines. Be mindful, please do not use this language, but this is from the actual act that began in Victoria. It was the first of its kind, but also the subsequent acts that followed from 1869 onwards. So these regulations included the removal of any Aboriginal child deemed neglected or left unprotected to mission stations or industrial reformatory schools. So essentially this took power from all the parents. They could remove any Aboriginal child deemed neglected or left unprotected. So mum or dad could be out working or out on the mission or out collecting food or whatever, and a child could be taken because they were left unprotected. So Aboriginal boys under 14 years of age and unmarried Aboriginal females under 18 shall reside, take their meals and sleep in any building set apart for such purposes according to the direction of the station manager. And this talks about the fracturing of Aboriginal families and the slow removal in the beginning. So 13-year-old half-caste boys were to be apprenticed and girls were to work as servants. And this is in law, this is in legislation. So Aboriginal children were forced, instead of what they promised, to get a better education, actually forcing them to go out and work for no money or little to none. So sending children of mixed descent, whether they had parents or not, to the Department of Neglected Children for their better care and custody. So I think, just think about that for a moment. Whether or not these children had parents, the state was taking them for their better care and custody. That literally says that it denies rights of Aboriginal people allowing to raise their children and takes that from them. So, yeah, families refusing to consent to the removal of their children were told they would have to leave stations and be denied rations. So it goes back into the forced poverty, I guess. You know, Aboriginal people forced onto these missions, forced away from a traditional way of life, forced onto rations, forced into houses. And then when they started to adapt to these things, they were told that if their children weren't given up, if they didn't consent to the removal of their children, that they would be denied all the support the government had offered. So between 1887 and 1954, private welfare agencies and individuals were authorised to apprehend children they suspected were neglected, assume guardianship of them, and keep them in institutions or in other forms of care. And when you really think about that, especially that statement, it's quite disgusting, because between 1887 and 1954, anyone, individual or from an agency, could take an Aboriginal child they suspected were neglected. And as I said earlier, neglect is an opinion. So this is where it comes down to removal of Aboriginal children for sexual exploitation, for slavery, for work, things like that. They didn't need an excuse. They didn't need to get permission. They could simply take it, and it was in legislation. So throughout 1960s, Vic police routinely investigated reports of girls under the age of 16 giving birth. And in these situations, they'd question Aboriginal girls, and if they didn't give up their children, they would threaten to charge them with immorality. So actually give them a charge for that. So prior to 1969, Vic police weren't legally required to report when an Aboriginal child was brought before the Children's Court. And when you think about it, that means that if an Aboriginal child is taken, that a family isn't notified as to where the child is going, who the child was taken by, and also doesn't give them a chance to actually get their child back and have a defence, to fight against that neglect charge. And this also meant that in Victoria, Aboriginal children were being charged with neglect. So they grew up already having a criminal record for something they didn't even do. And I think this is a big one as well. Until 1985, the Victorian police were empowered to forcibly remove children under child welfare laws. And I said it a bit earlier, but I think when you understand the context of the stolen generations, you can understand the relationship or the difficult relationship Aboriginal people now have with police because of intergenerational trauma, because of that fear. Especially when you look at up until 1985, they were able to forcibly remove children. So this is the picture, the image on the right is a image from the Bringing Home report, which I'll talk about a bit later. But it says essentially a group of tiny, why did it go over there? I love this image. It says a group of tiny half-caste children. Bear with me. So yeah, the image on the right is from the Bringing Home report, and it says a group of tiny half-caste and quadroon children of the Darwin half-caste home. The Minister for the Interior recently appeared to charitable organisations in Melbourne and in Sydney to find homes for the children and rescue them from becoming outcasts. And also some lady who's written underneath this, I like the little girl in the center of the group, but if taken by anyone else, any of the others would do, so long as they are strong. And if you think about it, it's pretty clear why she chose the girl in the middle. And if you're thinking it's because she's the fairest, then you would be correct. And if you think about why any of the others would do as long as they are strong, hopefully by now you would get to the conclusion that it was for slave labor, you know, for that little girl to be a domestic within a home. And the quote on the left, I'm going to read it out to you, is the thing that hurts me the most to this day is that they didn't care about who they put us with. As long as it looked like they were doing their job, it just didn't matter. They put me with one family and the man of the house used to come down and use me whenever he wanted to. Being raped over and over, there was no one I could turn to. They were supposed to look after me and protect me, but no one ever did. And I think that slide is really, really hard to see and hear, but it's important to acknowledge that this is essentially why we do the work that we do now and how thorough we need to be with the Aboriginal child placement principle, and also with the carers that we get, is because of this. Because previous policies allowed for people to remove children for no reason, and they weren't checked up on. It didn't matter where they go, where they went, and a lot of places they went were unsafe for our kids, not only experiencing cultural abuse, but verbal, physical, and often sexual abuse too. These are some of the examples from the foster homes and the institutions. Because I think a lot of white Australia thought, oh, we're helping out the Aboriginal people, and you know, they're getting better looked after and better care than they would be at home or on the mission. But these are some of the examples of the racial vilification and racial abuse that they experienced in the homes, such as being called black mongrel, a darkie, a bad, poor type of Aboriginal, an Aboriginal of poor colour, a poor type of darkie, and I don't even want to say the last one. But, you know, it also highlights the racism, the verbal abuse, but also the abuse and neglect that they experienced within the homes. For example, that quote, there was no food, nothing. We was all huddled up in a room like a little puppy dog on the floor. Sometimes at night we'd cry with hunger. We had to scrounge in the town dump, eating old bread, smashing tomato sauce bottles, licking them. Half of the time the food we got was from the rubbish dump. So there was no regulation for these missions. There wasn't checking up on the Aboriginal children. And if it was maybe once a month or once every 6 months, where they made everything act like it was fine. And then there's some further stats below that might really shock you. So 1 in 5 Aboriginal children reported sexual abuse in the foster homes. 1 in 10 children reported sexual abuse in institutions. And also 1 in 10 reported sexual abuse in a work placement. And I think it's always important to highlight that that's only the reported cases. That's not that doesn't include the amount of people who didn't feel comfortable to come forward or had also passed before the inquiry had happened. And, you know, some of these kids would have been, you know, experienced multiple forms of abuse in different placements, in different institutions, and different homes. So when you look at all of this, there's a lot of trauma in one place and multiple places. So the effects on individuals I will always state that there's more than one effect on individuals, and there's more than this. But I've got some examples and some quotes for you. So people were taught to reject their Aboriginality and also Aboriginal people. So we were told that our mother was an alcoholic, that she was a prostitute, and that she didn't care about us. They used to warn us that when we got older, we'd have to watch it because we'd turn into sluts and alcoholics. So we'd have to be very careful. If you're white, you didn't have that dirtiness in you. It was in our breed. So if you can throw yourself into that child's shoes and they're told that their culture, that their nationality, that who they are is bad, you can imagine how they would grow up feeling. Disconnected from their identity, from their people, and feeling like they mean nothing, that they are dirty, that they are going to amount to nothing. So Aboriginality was not positively affirmed. I got told my Aboriginality when I got whipped and they'd say, "You Abbo, you nigger." That was the only time I got told of my Aboriginality. So that was from confidential evidence in Victoria, and someone that was removed in 1967. When you think about it, 1967 was not that long ago. So children weren't told who their siblings, parents, or families were. When I started to get to know my father and he was telling me about my family and who I was related to, my heart nearly stopped because I had realised I had slept with first cousins on occasions. So it's not only about relationships happening when they shouldn't, when they were disrupting the kinship system. It was also on missions, on settlements, and also in the homes. Children weren't told who their siblings or family were. They didn't know they had a brother that was in the home. You know, one example from the Being Home report as well was, it kind of covers a lot of these, but, you know, it was the Cootamundra Aboriginal Girls Training Home, and one of the kids, so an older Aboriginal man had come to a fence when she was with her sister, and he was calling out to her by her first name. And, you know, he was calling to her, say, come to me. And, you know, she turned to her sister, and her sister wanted to go, but she said, you know, he's black, he's a black man, we can't go to him, we can't trust him. And it was only years later that she found out that the person, that old man who had come to find them, was her grandfather. So they were taught to reject their Aboriginality, reject Aboriginal people, and also had no idea who their kinship ties or connections or families were. So, and a big effect on our mob also is the institutionalisation. So the excessive physical punishments were also common. So dormitory life was like living hell. It was not a life. The only thing that sort of came out of it was that how to work, how to be clean, you know that, and hygiene, that sort of thing. But we got a lot of bashings. And when you think about the concept of institutionalisation, it didn't set these kids up from being released to care. So that's why a lot of our stolen gen, or some of our stolen gen mob, ended up back in the system and in the juvenile detention and also in the adult prisons, because all they were taught was abuse and not taught how to manage money or look after themselves or find work outside of that. Yeah. Institutionalisation is a big thing with intergenerational trauma. So we're just going to stop for a little while, maybe 5, 10, go to the toilet, get a cup of tea, call a family member if you need to, and just try to digest some of the information that I've already shared with you. But yeah, just take a second, because I know that this information, especially if you've never heard it before, is very hard to comprehend and take on. So just pause us for a little bit and start up again when you're ready. So guys, I hope that you had a good break. and just get ready, I guess, for the next couple of slides, because I know what we've covered hasn't been easy, but it is still difficult going through the rest of it. So bear with me. So this, I guess, leads us, what we've talked about, to the Bringing Home report. So I spoke a bit about it earlier, where the stolen generations term was coined. So this was as a result to the 1995 National Inquiry into the separation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from their families. So the inquiries ran through the Human Rights and Equal Opportunity Commission, and they published the Bringing Home report, which was tabled to the Australian Federal Parliament on the 26th of May in 1997. So this report is a pretty big thing within our community, and anything that I've spoken about before previously has come from, any quote or anything like that has come directly from the report. So I highly suggest that if you're interested, to actually have a look at the full report. It's 500 and something pages, but it's well worth the read. And I know that doing this particular Stolen Gen unit within our cultural awareness online package, you'll be checking out the YouTube clip, the 35-minute YouTube clip on the Bringing Home report. But essentially, there were 535 individual and group submissions that informed the Bringing Home report. So that means there were 535 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but also carers and homes or representatives that came forward to speak to the inquiry. But I always will acknowledge and highlight the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who had passed away before the commission occurred, so they weren't able to have their voices heard, and also the people who were too traumatised and didn't want to relive that trauma of coming forward and speaking. So I always acknowledge them and highlight that. So there were 54 recommendations that came forward from the Bringing Home report. And one of the big ones was for John Howard, who was the Prime Minister at the time, to apologise to the stolen generation survivors and communities and families. But good old Johnny Howard didn't believe that genocide happened in this country. And I actually have, and will share with you the definition of genocide according to the UN Convention in 1948. And it is, as any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial or religious group as such, killing members of the group, causing seriously bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and forcibly transferring children within the group to another group. And I think if you think and reflect quietly on that definition of genocide, you know, throughout the content of this unit, if we call it that, you know, on the stolen generations and also on colonisation, you can clearly come to the conclusion, an educated conclusion, that genocide happened in this country. So also part of this unit, you'll be looking at the Reconciliation Australia National Apology as well. So there are a couple of really significant dates within the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities in regards to the stolen generations. And one of those is May the 26th, which is the anniversary of the National, it's Sorry Day. And then February the 14th is the anniversary of the National Apology to the Stolen Generations by Kevin Rudd, which is both things that you'll be checking out, which is cool. But yes, it's a very, very big, important report for our mob. So the three key effects on stolen generations and Aboriginal families today. I will highlight that there's not just three, there's more than that. But if you understand these, you can understand, if you can understand and acknowledge what's happened with the stolen generation, you will be more able or more likely to engage and understand with Aboriginal people or families or communities that have been affected by the intergenerational trauma that has occurred because of this. Because we know it's estimated between 1 in 3 and 1 in 10 Aboriginal children are removed from their homes and communities. It's up to 100,000 children, but that's a loose figure. And of course, that's before the report was written. So it could, yeah, but it's said that it's not even said, it's known that not one Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander family hasn't been affected because of the stolen generation. So some of the key effects on stolen generations on Aboriginal families today include separation from family and community, Aboriginal parenting skills being undermined and often their children are at risk from being removed, and also loss of cultural heritage. So the separation from community and family. So the inquiry into the stolen generations found this led to insecurity and lack of self-esteem. So people experience feelings of worthlessness, depression, suicide, delinquency, and violence. Some were in prison, abused drugs, found intimacy difficult, and lacked trust. I think that it's really important to acknowledge that as Aboriginal people, we acknowledge that our children are at the highest risk, but then it is our stolen generation survivors that are at the highest risk of a lot of these things, being imprisoned, abusing drugs, or mental health issues and things like that. But especially things like intimacy being difficult. Uncle Jack Charles says in one of his books that he could never consummate a relationship because all the intimacy that he experienced before that was abuse. There's a quote from the Brigham Home Report, and it's a woman saying, she used drugs and alcohol like a band-aid with the trauma that she experienced. It was the only time she could be able to escape what had happened to her. And this comes into institutionalization and also intergenerational trauma. And this is also lacking trust, I think, just going back, but it's also lacking trust in the system and the welfare system and also people as well. I know that, for example, Marnie Dell, who was in the Cootamundra Aboriginal Girls Training Home, she lacked faith in the system so much that she said, she married up with a white fella because she thought that if she married up with a white fella, that they wouldn't take her kids. But, she said it didn't matter. They were going to take them anyway. And that's a reality. Aboriginal people couldn't, and stolen generation survivors because of what happened to them, couldn't trust the system, let alone navigate it. So Aboriginal parenting skills are undermined and their children at risk for being removed. So the inquiry found that people brought up in institutions or passed around different foster families didn't learn about good parenting, nurturing, and attachment. As a result, their children are at risk of being removed on the grounds of neglect or abuse. And as I said earlier, neglect is an opinion. And who's assessing this? A lot of the time, especially in other states, it's a non-Aboriginal organisation. But I spoke a bit earlier about my 2 black nans, and I'll always acknowledge Bargy, who was a stolen generation survivor. And I think it's always important that we reflect, where do we learn good parenting? We learn it from our parents. we learn it from the people around us. We learn it from friends, from extended family. And if our stolen gen members had only seen abuse, had never experienced, love, nurturing, someone caring for them, that the only experience that they'd had was someone denigrating their Aboriginal identity, abusing them physically, sexually, and emotionally, how can they possibly have learned how to care for a child? And I think always an important story that I always share is that my Bali, so she was taken to the Cootamundra Aboriginal Girls Training Home. And she experienced all those forms of abuse: sexual, physical, verbal, emotional. And check out the Bring Home report, because you can't deny what happened there. But an example of this is that later on, when she had kids of her own, so Bargy is my dad's mother. My auntie, my dad's sister, came to my mum and said, I'm being abused and I don't know what to do about it. And mum and dad ended up helping out and, making sure she was safe and getting her away from the house. And Bargy actually turned to my mother and said, I dealt with it, why can't she? And I think that shows the experience that she had, because in the home and in the work placement that she had after that, abuse, sexual abuse, physical, emotional, all of that, financial, was all okay. So when her daughter experienced it, that was the normal. On the flip side, it's great that each generational cycle can be broken. And, Bargy came back to my mother years later and actually said, she understood that it was wrong. After years and years of thinking that was okay, she'd finally faced that it wasn't. But, unfortunately, this cycle is a continuing, ongoing cycle. And that's why, for example, at VACCA, we have a family that's had 5 generations in care, because it is a hard cycle to break. And that's why in the next couple of things, we'll be talking about how to break that through resilience and culture and things like that. But it's always important to be informed because of this. So number 3, the loss of cultural heritage. So the inquiry found that many forcibly removed children and their children have lost their cultures, languages, heritage, and lands. For many of those removed, this lack of cultural heritage and knowledge continues through their adult lives and affects their well-being and sense of self. And my other nan, who's passed away now as well, her 2 oldest sisters were taken by the welfare because they were Aboriginal, not because they were being neglected or anything like that. And flip side, my great-grandmother stole the kids back. She stole the kids back, and then for the 8 kids that she had after that, she told them, you are not to identify as Aboriginal. We're either Native American or of Italian descent. And they constantly moved around as well. And because of that, they weren't connected to culture, to country, or to family. They didn't get to grow up learning cultural traditions or their languages because of this disconnection. And even when you look at, for example, native title rights, one of the things that you have to prove legally is the continuous and ongoing connection to that country. So that's where the stolen generation has denied the rights of Aboriginal people to go for native title and claim their traditional country. And I think with a lot of the clients sometimes that we work with, especially, our young people who end up in resi care units, you can see the loss of cultural heritage there, and you can see how much it affects, their self-esteem and how, their Aboriginal identity as well. They don't understand what that means or how to be proud of it, or, the fact that they are part of the oldest living culture in the world. It's because of that loss of cultural heritage. It's because of their parents, their grandparents being fearful of identifying, being fearful that their children would be removed if they did, and also being brainwashed in a sense to be, assimilated into a community that, they would lose their culture if they did. But sometimes they had no choice to do other than to do that. So yes, that's a lot. But moving on to our final slide of this is, I think it's always important when we look at the stolen generations, we also look at the current grief and loss in any Aboriginal community or family, or even an individual. And this includes personal experience of incarceration, drug and alcohol abuse, domestic violence, sexual, emotional or physical abuse and neglect. And I think, there's always stereotypes and racial biases that are out there. Like, we know, I think our women are something ridiculously like 20 times more likely to be in a domestic violence relationship. And, people would assume that would be with an Aboriginal man, but in 85% of the cases, it's actually with a non-Aboriginal partner. The inability to pass on culture from generation to generation, the loss of traditional roles and responsibilities for their families, and also being thrust into the Western world, being told that a kinship system isn't valued, or that responsibilities to their families aren't important, or that, not valuing how important those are, because it's not done in the Western system the same way it's done in an Aboriginal community or an Aboriginal family. So loss of Aboriginal children, family members, community members and elders through early death or long-term separation. And this is talking about things like, we are in fact have the highest suicide rates in the entire world for a people. We are the most incarcerated people in the world. And also things like the huge gap between our life expectancies between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people in this country. And if you haven't checked out the Closing the Health Gap report. Basically, it hasn't changed much since it came out, but essentially it's pretty much 10 to 20 years difference between an Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people. And it's a bit of a, I guess, running joke that Aboriginal people are supposed to die at our desks, because, the retirement age is being pushed up to 70, when statistically Aboriginal men are supposed to live to 45 to 50, and Aboriginal women, we're lucky if we get to 60. And of course that depends on where you are in the country, whether it's regional, remote or rural communities, and access to healthcare. But it's always important to acknowledge the gap that is there between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people. So cultural abuse and racism, systemic, lateral, personal and interpersonal. I think that hopefully you can acknowledge, after hearing a lot of this and also the work that we should have done, or you should have looked at previously, that we have a systemic problem. It comes from the top down. And the system is killing our people, especially when you look at the healthcare system, what is the word? The health system, and also prisons and things like that. Aboriginal people dying in custody still, things like that. The system is failing us. Lateral violence is a big thing within the community, which is basically what we call tall poppy syndrome. But you guys can Google that. Personal cultural shame. This happens a lot when a person is newly identified, for example, or comes from a different community. That can happen quite often. And this has been interrupted because of the stolen generation. Everyone has different cultural knowledge and has been on a different culture journey as well. Colonization, obviously, a big loss of spirituality, land, language, and culture due to colonization and stolen gen. Developmental trauma, you look at the result of abuse and neglect during the early years. So high cognitive and neurological and psychological development, because we know that essentially trauma affects the brain. We know that trauma affects the brain, but then it's also things like our higher rate of diabetes, heart disease, kidney disease, and things like that. And it's not because of stuff that we've done. When you look at it historically, we've lived a healthy, sustainable lifestyle for over 65,000 years. And, only in the 30, we've been forced onto, tea, sugar, and things like that. And our body hasn't had time to adapt to that. So that's why we have big issues like that within our community. And not to mention, drug and alcohol abuse, especially alcohol, that was a means to pay our mob, and also means for the stolen generation, for example, to cope with trauma and things like that. But yeah, intergenerational trauma, continuing effects of separation being passed down generation to generation. And that's actually been a young Aboriginal girl in WA committed suicide, and the coroner did an inquiry because it was a pandemic or something, like it was happening all the time. And he found that one of the reasons why this young girl had committed suicide was because of intergenerational trauma and racism. So it's a big thing, intergenerational trauma, for our people, and something that we do experience. So anyway, I feel like I've talked a lot, but essentially just keep in mind of this when you work with our mob, our community members, our families, but also with Aboriginal people within the workforce, that we will experience one or more of these, not only, probably on a daily basis. So just being mindful of that. So that is my end slide. I hope that you do something that is very self-care motivated after this session. And I hope and look forward to the discussions that we're going to have about this. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me or write them down, so we can give you the answers or the information. Just please look after yourself, because I know this stuff is not easy to hear. But thanks for bearing with me, guys.